once, no matter the cost or difficulty. Rome was here to stay. The history of Rome is bookended by barbarian sacks. It would be 850 years before another foreign invader stepped foot in the city. By then, Rome had risen, crested, declined, and was in the process of failing. Brennus' sack of Rome, on the other end, ushered in Rome's era of dominance. Until the sack, Rome was merely one among many in Italian politics, fighting and winning, but also dealing with setbacks and defeats. After the destruction of Rome, the Romans were reborn along with the physical city they lived in. It would be a more determined, more consciously imperial citizen body that would emerge in the 300s BC. The Romans would never again find themselves under the yoke of a foreign power, nor their walls breached by an invading force. When, in the 400s AD, the Visigoths and then the Vandals finally sacked the city, the level of despair was grossly inflated because the inviolability of the city had been taken for granted. Other cities changed hands, were occupied, or expelled occupiers. This was the natural ebb and flow of ancient politics. But Rome itself would be eternally free, granted special status by the gods. The Vandal sack, for all the physical damage it did, destroyed Rome psychologically, a blow from which it never recovered. And this sense of invincibility was born in the aftermath of the last barbarian sack, 850 years earlier. The Gallic victory humiliated, offended, and horrified the Romans who endured it, and they vowed to never let it happen again. They successfully kept their word for almost 1,000 years, a remarkable feat in the perilous and violent world of antiquity. Roman obstinacy, steadfast endurance, and unflinching resolve. A commitment to existence born out of near total destruction. From a practical standpoint, the sack also brings to an end the period of early Roman history about which we have no clear records or primary sources. Though all the previous records were lost in the fire, the Romans simply started again, leaving us a wealth of documentation that puts our understanding of their history on much firmer footing from this point on. I am thankful to say that the legend of Rome has finally ended and the history of Rome has begun. Next week, the Romans begin the slow process of rebuilding. Their task was complicated by the fact that all their enemies, past and present, would attempt to take advantage of their weakened state. The Volscians and Aequians, of course, attacked, as always, but Latin allies revolted as well, and even some of Rome's own colonies decided the time was ripe to throw off the yoke of their mother city. But Camillus, not called the second founder of Rome for nothing, would lead the Romans to triumph and restore them on their inevitable path to glory. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. At the opening of the 6th book of his monumental history of Rome since its foundation, Livy wrote, "The history of the Romans from the foundation of the city to its capture, first under kings, then under consuls and dictators, decemviri and consular tribune, wars abroad and dissensions at home, I have set out in 5 books, covering matters which were obscure, both through their great antiquity, like objects dimly perceived in the far distance, and because in those days there were few written records, the only reliable means of preserving the memory of past events. A further reason was the loss of most of such accounts as were preserved in the commentaries of the pontiffs and other public and private records when the city was destroyed by fire. From now on, a clearer and more reliable account can be given of the city's civil and military history after it made a second start, reborn as it were from its old roots with increased vigor and productivity." That seems like a good place to start this week. Rome was devastated. The city was in ruins, and the population, what remained of it anyway, despaired. Officially, the subject of abandoning Rome had been closed, but unofficially, the idea was still a potent force. Why rebuild when perfectly good homes sat vacant in a well-positioned, defensible city? The Romans had been merciless in their annihilation of the Veites, and the Etruscan city was practically a ghost town. But the Senate's mind was made up, and the Romans were ordered to rebuild, each according to their means. Camillus, whom the people now looked upon as twice their savior, if we believe the legends, stood firm behind staying in Rome, and the population, some reluctantly, followed their hero's lead. The new Rome that would grow out of the ashes of the Gallic sack would be recognizable today, with its haphazard streets and deep tangled neighborhoods clearly devoid of any central planning. There was in fact no planning whatsoever. The Romans simply picked up what material they could salvage and began rebuilding wherever the whims of each individual directed. Rome, and I say this with love, is, and has been since the 380s BC, a convoluted mess that defies logic. The irony being that in almost every other town, city, or camp built by the Romans, rational right angles was the norm. A model was developed for the fortified military camp that centered around bisecting perpendicular roads that was copied in almost every other settlement the Romans established. A centurion encamped in Britain would have been able to easily navigate his way around a camp, their standard grid city layout with them. But the Eternal City itself was the dark city of this Roman Type A OCD. And the roots of that chaos lay in the years after the Gallic sack, when the Romans rebuilt quickly, but without any kind of master plan. Not that this is necessarily the Romans' fault. As they were attempting to rebuild their shattered city, nearly every one of their formerly subdued enemies took their shot at setting themselves free of the Roman hegemony. As I mentioned at the end of last week, the usual suspects, particularly the Volscians, reappeared, but longtime allies now rose up as well. Piling it on Rome became the fad du jour among long disgruntled Latin communities, who never got over Rome's breaking up of the Latin League 100 years earlier at the Battle of Lake Regillus. Even colonies set up by Rome, with strong ties to the city, joined in the rebellions and kicked their mother city while she was down. While trying to put their lives back together, the Romans kept being recalled to arms, now to fight on this front, now to fight that enemy, now to fight this former friend. It is no wonder the city grew so haphazardly. There was barely enough time to nail down the roof before it was time to go and fight again. Throughout these years, Camillus was the rock behind which the insecure Romans hid. In times of danger, they turned to him again and again to lead them to victory. Whether he was appointed official dictator, as he was in 389, 368, and for the fifth and final time, 367 BC, or whether he was elected as one of the military tribunes for that year, Camillus was unquestionably the leader of Rome. Everyone relied upon his strategic and tactical brilliance to see them through these dark times. His enemies, and he did have a few, accused him of arrogance, of treating his fellow tribunes as if they were his vassals, not his equals. But the people were indifferent to these accusations. Camillus was their man. Plus, the other commanders did little to inspire the people's confidence. At one point, a tribune leading a legion against an allied army of Latins and Volscians saw his army flee in terror and hide behind their camp walls. Camillus was ordered to take command, and, by his very presence, instilled the soldiers with enough confidence to march back out and defeat the enemy they thought so powerful. Camillus dominated his time, and it would be another 150 years until anyone emerged to equal him in the pantheon of Roman heroes. That man, Scipio Africanus, who delivered the Romans from the scourge of Hannibal, is often mentioned in the same breath as Camillus, and indeed, the consensus opinion is that later historians, Plutarch and Livy especially, colored their descriptions of Camillus to make him seem a prelude to the great Scipio of Africa. But as Camillus remained in the people's high esteem, another hero fell from grace. Marcus Manlius Capitolinus, the last name attached in honor of his bravery during the Gallic siege, would soon find himself etched into Roman history not as a great hero, but as a villain. After the withdrawal of the Gauls, Manlius's ego was severely bruised by the honors heaped upon Camillus, and he took them as a personal insult. Had he and the others not held out against the Gauls, Camillus never would have had the opportunity to save them. Surely that deserves some glory, but Camillus hogged it all. Manlius was one of the few amongst the citizen body who could not stand the sight of Camillus, who he considered to be a pompous fraud. This aggravation led Manlius to break ranks with his fellow patricians and take up the cause of the plebes. By making himself their champion, Manlius hoped to do an end run around Camillus and earn the acclaim he felt he deserved. The most pressing issue of the day was debt relief. Obviously, as the Romans rebuilt, there was a hefty amount of borrowing going on, and the interest payments began to bankrupt the population. Every day saw men hauled off to prison for defaulting on loans. Men who had fought at Veii and stood firm against the Gauls were daily being made slaves by moneylenders who showed no mercy or compassion. Manlius spoke out publicly in favor of relief and often paid the debts of former soldiers out of his own pocket and offered interest-free loans to any who asked. The patricians were disturbed by Manlius's new image as the savior of the people, not only because they saw him as letting irresponsible debtors off the hook, but also because he constantly slipped in references to the great untapped strength of the populace and how their numerical superiority ought to count for something in the formation of policy. The patricians saw these as veiled and not so veiled threats against the established order and began to see Manlius as a revolutionary figure. Manlius was arrested once on charges of bringing false claims of theft against the moneylenders, but public outcry was so great that they were forced to release him. With peace abroad to allow for real public unrest, riots began to break out between patrician and plebe factions, Manlius offering daily harangues against the tyranny of the nobles and offering himself as the only patrician who cared about his fellow citizens. The implication was clear: throw out the Senate and elect a new democratic government with me as your leader. Finally, unable to take it anymore, the patricians again arrested Manlius, this time on charges of sedition and treason. The trial of Manlius would become famous for the way it would play out. The trial was originally held on the Campus Martius, which lay in the shadow of the Capitoline Hill. During his defense, Manlius was able to stretch his hand up to the hill and remind the people of his great service to the city, asking how anyone could possibly believe he was now engaged in treason. The argument was having its effect, so the savvy patricians adjourned the trial to a different location. Now, without the Capitoline as a backdrop, the charges and evidence against Manlius stood on their own merits. Public opinion turned against Manlius, who, it became obvious, was engaged in an active conspiracy to overthrow the Senate. The verdict was swift and harsh. He was to be thrown from the Tarpeian Rock, a steep cliff on the Capitoline Hill used for executions, ironically dying in disgrace a few feet from where he had achieved his greatest glory. The death of Manlius did nothing to end plebeian unrest, however. Manlius saw an opportunity and exploited it. He did not create the conditions for that opportunity. The plebes' overriding concern at this point were, as we have seen, debt relief, but the old standbys of land redistribution and access to political power rose again. The former problem was wrapped up in the latter two, and the plebes began to focus their energy on land and power questions. Both the land taken from VA in the north and the land taken from the Volscians in the south conspicuously wound up in the hands of a few patrician landowners rather than being divided up amongst the masses. How were the people supposed to pay off their debts when they were denied the income land provided? Further, how was it that state policy had obviously whatever concessions had been made to the plebes in the past had lost their potency? The plebes finally saw the office of military tribune and consular power for what it was, an attempt to water down plebe authority and deny them access to the consulship, the ultimate office of the state. One man in particular, a patrician with 2 daughters, took it upon himself to end once and for all this unbalance. Marcus Fabius Ambustus, a patrician who enjoyed plebe support, had married his eldest daughter to an influential patrician and his youngest to a wealthy plebe named Gaius Licinius Polo. The younger daughter complained that she would never receive the honors her elder sister received on account of her husband's plebe status. Fabius, the story goes, promised his daughter she would have everything her sister had and began working with his son-in-law Licinius to break the patrician stranglehold on the consulship. They began by pointing out to people that despite plebe access to the office of military tribune, no plebe had been elected to said office for the last decade, which was true. They then demanded a permanent return to the dual consulship, with the stipulation that one of the consuls had to be a plebe. Licinius got himself elected tribune of the plebes, an office that had fallen